The views and opinions expressed on the Nova Society are those of the panelists and guests and do not necessarily reflect the views or opinions of the Phoenix Research Institute or any institution which any panel member is associated. Reproduction or dissemination other than for the purpose of education or information without the express written permission of the Phoenix Research Institute or Nova Society Media is strictly prohibited.
I'd like to welcome everyone back to the Nova Society. I'm your host, Dr. Brooklyn Ann Weldon, and I'm here with my panel, Dr. Scott Gershwer and Dr. Mark Bound. Today we are joined by David Cay Johnston, who should be well known to many of you, and we are extremely excited and delighted to have Professor Johnston here as our guest.
But that brings me to a great segue. So, David, you know a lot about economics, far more than I do. I think economics like I think of weathermen. You could be an economist and a weatherman, be wrong 50% of the time, and you still keep your job. I look at it more like wizardry. You've already, in the last episode, you brought up how good the economy was doing. Can Donald Trump screw that up?
Oh, yes.
And how could he screw that up?
Yeah. If Donald does what he says he's going to do, it will cause severe economic pain. And let me give you a real good example of this. Donald gets rousing applause every time he says he's going to put tariffs on China. Well, most people believe him when he says China will pay. China won't pay a dime. But there's a second element to this, which I have yet to see a single national broadcast, New York Times, Wall Street Journal, Washington Post, LA Times writer, Bloomberg even writer, get onto. I wrote this for the New Republic a couple of weeks ago. Imagine you own a car company, Scott's Car Company, and you sell cars for $10,000. You compete against Chinese-made cars that sell for $10,000, and you make a $1,000 profit on each car. Donald imposes a 60% tariff. So the Chinese cars that Brooklyn sells are now going to cost $16,000 to the consumer. Are you going to leave your price at $10,000 and make $1,000 a car? Not a chance. You're going to raise the price of your cars to $15,000 because you're going to undercut Brooklyn cars made in China. Your profit will now be $6,000 a car, not $1,000. And remember, the whole principle of capitalism is profit maximization, which has worked out to be a very good idea. And so even if the number of cars you sell falls by half, you're still going to make vastly more money. Donald Trump's tariffs are a scheme to redistribute upward, to take money from the pockets of consumers and put it in the pockets of people who own American manufacturing companies. Now, if you're a new developing country like the United States was before the Civil War, you want to have tariffs. If you're Argentina or Honduras, you want to have tariffs because your domestic industries don't have any financial muscle and you want to build them up. You don't want to be, in the early days of the American Republic, you wanted to limit the number of stoves people bought that were made in England or Germany, and you wanted to build an American stove making industry. And by imposing a tariff and creating these surplus profits from the raising your price to just below the tariffed price of the imported good, manufacturers built up the money to do research, to improve their production methods, to become more efficient, and then become on their own. Donald doesn't know this. Donald doesn't know anything. He has a degree from Penn. It's not from the Wharton School, which is a graduate business school. It's from the one professor undergraduate real estate program at Penn. And he didn't earn that degree. It was given to him. There's lots
David,
of
don't
stuff.
hold back. Tell us what you really think.
Yeah. Well, I mean, Donald is not dumb, but he's not in any way educated or analytical or thoughtful. Donald's great skill is, first of all, as a con artist, he knows how to pick people whose pockets he can pick, and he's really, really good at that. I mean, I admire his skill enormously. And secondly, it's in figuring out how to take something that's crystal clear waters and muddy them so that you're confused. And then, you either trust him or don't trust him. And a slight majority of Americans obviously trust him. And then he layers onto this wild claims. I have a mandate from the American people. You won by one of the narrowest margins. I think it's among the 7 or 8 closest margins in American presidential history. And no, you don't have a mandate. You won. You're the president. You won, but you do not have a mandate. You want a mandate? Ronald Reagan, 1984, won 49 states. Lyndon Baines Johnson, 1964. Those are mandates.
Yeah. Unless anybody has a follow-up on that, I'm going to change the topic a little bit because another part of being from Brooklyn is I know a lot of Russians, and I've seen the influence of Russians in my old neighborhood. When I go back to visit my mom, they're buying up all the houses, tearing them down, and building these enormous dachas, and they're all fenced in, and they got all their cars out there and everything, and they're doing really, really well in my old neighborhood. It's one of the things that I've always found most intriguing is how he's managed to dodge the fact that he's a Russian mob associate.
Yeah. Well, Donald in 1987 made a luxury, all expenses paid tour of the old Soviet Union paid for by the Russians. The Russians have courted him for longer than that. At least going back to 1979. Now, we do that too. We court people overseas who we think could be useful to us, business people, academics, whatever. So it's per se, that's just the way the world works. But Donald has an incredibly long history and affinity for Russians. And he said publicly, they put a lot of money in my pocket. He said that of the Saudis too. Why should I think badly of them? I wrote virtually nothing about the Steele dossier. The only thing I did was explain to some people, said, what is it? And I'd explain it. I didn't take any position about it, except to say it's raw intelligence. It's not refined intelligence. Raw intelligence is gossip. Here's what we've heard. And refined intelligence is after a great deal of analysis to figure out what's going on. But in May of 2017, just weeks after moving into the White House, Donald Trump had an unannounced meeting with Sergei Lavrov, the Russian foreign minister, and Sergei Kislyak, the ambassador, both of whom deeply trained in spycraft. And a photographer for TASS, the official news agency, was let into the room with his gadget bag, and God only knows what electronic equipment he may have had in that bag. I mean, we don't know. We would never have known of this meeting except the Russians announced it. Shortly after this meeting, leaks came out in a number of our allied countries saying we're going to pull back on sharing intelligence with the United States because Donald Trump gave the Russians sources and methods. That's how did we learn this and who did we learn it from? And shortly after this on state television, cameras followed a bunch of burly guys in suits into a meeting in a typical Russian government office building. They threw a bag over the guy at the head of the table, and he disappeared. And other people who cover national security have written about this. Apparently was the name of somebody where Donald bragged to him. And knowing Donald, I can see Donald saying, hey, you don't know anything. I get this guy in the White House telling me everything you guys are doing, and naming somebody. We know that after he left the White House and illegally took all sorts of documents, he showed them to other people. He hid them when he was supposed to turn them over. He lied and denied. He told an Australian businessman how close American submarines can get to Russian submarines before they're detected. We have spent enormous fortunes on how to polish and cut the screws on the propellers on submarines to make them super silent. We spent God, I wouldn't be shocked to hear it was more than $10 billion just on that. And he gave this away. Donald is indiscreet. He has no concept of honor and privacy and secrecy. And I would contrast that with the night that Barack Obama made fun of Donald Trump at the Gridiron Dinner. That's the White House Correspondents' annual dinner where you make fun of the president. He got up and his speechwriters had written for Obama, Well, I see Donald Trump is in the audience. Thank goodness I don't have to make the weighty decisions he has to make, like, should I fire Meatloaf? And everybody's laughing except Donald Trump, who's clearly furious. And knowing Donald, that's how he would be. At that very night, Osama bin Laden's death was on the table. They were deciding, are we going to go after him tonight or not? Obama held everybody off for one day because he wasn't satisfied they were ready to go. Nothing he said or did suggested in any way that something that momentous was happening. I mean, if they went and flubbed this the way Jimmy Carter flubbed the effort to rescue the Iranian hostages from Tehran in 1979, 1980, it would be the end of his presidency. And Donald isn't like that. He is a hollow vessel, and he's constantly in desperate need of reassurance. And that's why he says the things he does. You know, he makes these crude comments about Arnold Palmer's manhood. He gets furious at people who point out he has small hands. Petty things of no consequence that loom enormously large in his jumbled mind.
Well, in the show Curb Your Enthusiasm, I don't know if you're a fan, but Larry David doesn't like the coffee that he gets, and he has a spite store that he calls it. And Donald Trump's was a spite presidency based on that night of Barack Obama making fun of him. And he ran for president out of spite, and he ran a spiteful presidency. In his off years, he's been hauled into court a number of times. So he's spiteful about the DOJ, which explains Matt Gaetz. And, we're dealing with like somebody with the mentality of a 3-year-old.
Oh,
and
yes.
And we're all going to be suffering because of this.
Well, Scott, Donald is emotionally, he's a child. There's no two ways about that. The summer he turned 13. So think of the year for each of us that you went through puberty. Almost all of us in junior high school. I don't think any human being I know wants to go through that year again. It's just awful. You feel awkward. You're treated awkward. You don't understand what's happening to you unless you have extraordinary parents. Donald was sent off by his father to a military academy in New York, a military academy notorious, it turns out, for the hazing of new students, new cadets, and particularly sexually humiliating them. Now, imagine if when you were a teenager, you had gone through some kind of ritual where you were deeply humiliated. And then think about how Donald Trump talks about women the way junior high school boys do. Donald Trump's life is the comedy film by Harold Ramis, Groundhog Day, but it's Groundhog Day, the nightmare. He has been trapped in the emotions and thoughts of a 13-year-old boy for more than 65 years. And I can't imagine a more horrible existence. And on top of that, because of the dynamics of his family, Donald has never known love, contentment, happiness. He is this horribly empty vessel, and he has no compunctions about lying. His father taught him that, if lying gets you money, do it. That little story that will tell you a lot about Donald. There was a neighbor boy named Johnny Messer. Johnny went on to become the body man, the chief aide to Mayor Ed Beam in New York. And he grew up 2 or 3 houses down the street from Fred Trump's house, where Donald grew up. And he's riding his bicycle on the sidewalk one day when he's, I think, 7 years old. And he realizes he dropped a quarter out of his pocket. He turns around to go back just as Fred Trump pulls up at the end of the day in his Cadillac. Stops in the driveway. Fred Trump gets out, walks to the sidewalk, picks up the quarter, and says, "It's mine now." Who does that to a little boy? What kind of a monster does that? Now, imagine you're Donald Trump and this is your dad every single day. Of course, you're screwed up.
Yeah, and it does also explain Eric and Don Jr. And hopefully Melania, who I'm not a big fan of, hopefully Melania is in some way protected Barron from this, because you don't see a lot of interaction going on
Right.
there. But it's an interesting family dynamic that creates who we are as adults. And I think you're exactly right that that kind of environment, I guess the best way I would describe it, that cutthroat environment. When you
yes.
come from that,
Yes.
it creates who you're going to be, and actually it makes you have that worldview. All the world is like this.
Yep.
When in fact it is not. I guess my last question is going to be regarding Donald Trump and the rest of the world, because as I said, my thing is international. First of all, do you think that we're going to become a lot more closer to the Russians and the Chinese with Trump in office? And where do you see us as far as like our supposed current allies today? What is the second Trump term going to mean? And the last thing I would ask is, and this is for Brooklyn, do you think that in 2028, Donald Trump's going to try to stay in office?
Okay, first of all, Brooklyn, you got to ask a question before we go. You can't just be white guys.
Well, no,
She,
it probably is the rooster's going off in the back, so that's probably what it is.
So Donald Trump is a serious threat to American national security. And we've had a number of top national security people say this. It's not me, it's people who this is their business to know, including John Bolton, who, whatever you think of his views on foreign policy, John Bolton is a serious student of national security and knows his stuff. Even people who detest his views wouldn't disagree with that. Whereas Trump has put in as his director of national intelligence, Tulsi Gabbard, who clearly thinks highly of the Russians. Donald doesn't know how to keep secrets. So there is something called Five Eyes intelligence. That's the US, Canada, the United Kingdom, Australia, and New Zealand. You want to get a feel for this, there's a TV show called Pine Gap about, and I was there recently, can't go to Pine Gap, but inside of it in Australia, and how they share intelligence. That's going to pull back greatly on sharing with Donald Trump. Other countries are going to be careful about sharing with our administration for fear that their secrets will be given away to their adversaries. Donald has the reason, that of all the people who apply to go to work in the State Department, only 3% get hired. And a tiny fraction of those have the really serious jobs. You got to be incredibly smart and strategic in your thinking and know a lot. And Donald couldn't pass the Secret Service exam when he was young. The Foreign Service exam when he was young, if he had to. I mean, I'd be shocked if he got 20% right. So we will, in going forward, have much closer relationship with the Kremlin. The Kremlin is broke. They are seriously broke. And the sanctions put in place by Biden, almost all sanctions are cosmetic. The sanctions Biden put in place really work. Now, Putin has figured out over several years how to get around a lot of them, but they have almost no foreign currency left. Their economy is in a complete shambles. They've had to call up North Korean troops to prosecute the invasion of Ukraine and talk about using nuclear weapons, which is the sign of how weak the Russian position is. I would fault Joe Biden here that in the very beginning he should have said, we're going to give you everything you need to push back the Russians. And instead he was slow and incremental, just as Merrick Garland, the Attorney General, was. At the same time, Donald is attacking our friends. He denigrates and attacks people in the United Kingdom. He denigrates and attacks leaders in Japan, South Korea, elsewhere, because that's just who he is. Donald, there's only two kinds of people. It's people who submit to me and people who don't. And combine his lack of knowledge with his affinity for the Russians and all the money they have put in his pocket over the years. There was one guy, a Russian, who showed up to buy Trump Tower apartments with literally bags of cash to pay. Trump made a fortune off of Trump Tower because he was able to sell his apartments for way above the price per square foot of other luxury buildings in Manhattan. And his building was not a luxury building, by the way. It had linoleum floors in the kitchen, and they were small galley kitchens and the cheapest wainscoting you've ever seen. Because every other big expensive building, Fifth Avenue, Park Avenue, you had to run a gauntlet on your finances, and they could turn you down for any reason. I have a friend who's a longtime movie star, couldn't get into a building until I wrote a nice letter for her, and it persuaded a majority of the board that she was a nice person, contrary to her public image. And Donald would sell to anybody. If you went to Donald and said, I want to buy 5 of your apartments, as this Russian did, and I want you to title them in the name Snow Inc., Donald would never say to you, oh, is that a ski lodge in Aspen, or is that a cocaine trafficking business? And Donald, by the way, spent 10 years doing extraordinary favors for one of the biggest cocaine dealers in America. There's public record of this. It's all in the public record. Favors that make no sense unless they were in business together. So Donald will make friends with people who flatter him. He will blow up alliances. He's going to try and undo NATO or weaken it. And that matters because Vladimir Putin is on the record going back to the previous century, previous millennium, that he wants to put the old Soviet Union back together. I have relatives by the marriage of one of my 8 grown children in Eastern Europe. And they and everybody I know around them says if Ukraine falls, it's just a matter of time until the Russian tanks come and we're back under the boot of the Kremlin. So this is a serious national security threat to the U.S. We have a child who does not understand the 3-dimensional chess of international diplomacy. And things will happen that will bring this to bear. Now, one thing we have going for us is that Donald Trump's chief of staff, the first woman chief of staff in American history, Ms. I guess she pronounced it Wiles. She is clearly a very rational, thoughtful person who has managed Donald and kept away the most outrageous people to some degree. And I think she will prove to be very important to what happens to us going forward. And then finally on this point, I wrote and said in 2015 and 16 that if Donald Trump gets to the White House, he'll never leave peacefully, which goes to your question, and that if Donald Trump starts firing generals and admirals, you should really wake up, because that tells you he intends to put in place a military dictatorship. There are always lieutenants, captains, majors who, for their own vainglorious reasons and ideology, will sell out their country. We have developed a completely apolitical military. I've interviewed many general officers of the United States military, admirals and generals. I've walked away from some of them going, what a jerk. But I have never walked away from one and said, how in the world did that idiot get promoted to that job? We do a really incredibly fantastic job of selecting officers for promotion. I'm sure that a lot of people who should become generals and admirals don't make it, but I've never met one who, in my view, shouldn't be there. I'm sure there are some around, but we do a great job at this. Donald has announced that he intends to court-martial people. Now, you retire as an officer, you are subject to being called back till you're 70 years old. General Milley is in his 60s. Donald wants to have him court-martialed. He's talked about executing him. He's talked about executing the generals in charge of the withdrawal from Afghanistan, the date for which and timing of which was set by Donald Trump. And by the way, I don't think we train our military officers how to withdraw. I've asked that of 2 people at 2 of the academies, and they tell me, what are you talking about? But these people didn't commit treason. Now, the one blockade, the one protection there is that if you want to court-martial General Milley, other generals will sit on the panel that will judge him, and presumably they will acquit. They are not going to go along with this. But what will happen to our military going forward? Donald's going to try and politicize it. And that's very bad. And he says repeatedly, as recently as a few days ago, he intends to use the American military internally. That's what dictators do.
And we will continue this conversation with our special guest, Professor David Cay Johnston, in our next episode. We hope you will continue to join us. So that's all the time we have for today's episode. The Nova Society is a production of the Phoenix Research Institute. We'd like to thank our sponsor for this week's episode, the Phoenix Research Group, an independent research consortium offering social issue solutions to NGOs and international government agencies through multidisciplinary, nonpartisan, and unbiased research. We'd also like to thank our podcast partners, Buzzsprout, who hosts the Nova Society, Audacity, our editing partners, Podkite, who does all our analytics, iHeart Radio, where people get their music and podcasts, Apple iTunes, the largest source of music and podcasts on the internet, Spotify, the most popular source for the Nova Society. The Nova Society is available on all these and other quality platforms mentioned in our description. We'd like to thank our listeners. Without you, the Nova Society would not be possible. If you have a comment, a question, or would like to be a guest on the Nova Society, we can be reached at nova.society.podcast@gmail.com. Always remember, the power of society is knowledge. So for Dr. Scott Gershwer, Dr. Priscilla Hobbs, Dr. Brooklyn Ann Weldon, and all of us here at the Nova Society, I'm Dr. Mark Bound. Be well, and we hope to see you again next time.